The CIA's silent pistol for inducing heart attacks. For decades, paranoids whispered in corners that the secret services were capable of killing people remotely, skillfully faking a normal heart attack. The general public merely twirled their fingers at their temples. Paranoia, they said, get your head treated. But in the fall of 1975, CIA Director William Colby personally brought to the Senate hearings a pistol that looked more like a prop from a science fiction film. This device was officially called an indistinguishable microbioinoculator. Essentially, what lay before the politicians was a modified military pistol with a scope. A battery for a silent electric trigger had been built into its grip. This miracle fired not lead, but a thin ice needle laced with saxitoxin, a highly potent poison extracted from seaweed. The firing range was about 100 meters. The impact of the ice cube felt like the light bite of a common mosquito. The arrow pierced clothing, instantly melted inside the body, and left no evidence except a tiny red dot on the skin. To any doctor, death looked like a common heart attack. The poison paralyzed breathing in seconds. The person fell, gasping for air, and died, supposedly of natural causes. The perfect tool for political assassinations. The most remarkable thing here is the intelligence agency's disregard for the orders of their superiors. In 1969, President Richard Nixon directly ordered the destruction of all biological weapons stockpiles, but intelligence officials ignored the order and hid the poison in a secret warehouse. As part of a chemical weapons program called Project Naomi, $3 million taxpayer dollars were spent on this research. The weapons were created, the budgets were spent, and the laws were buried. And these are not the fantasies of madmen, but the dry reports of an official investigation. Operation Northwoods. Talk of a government capable of committing terrorist attacks against its own people for political gain is usually dismissed as profound paranoia. No normal person would believe that well-fed generals in their luxurious offices could cold-bloodedly plan the mass murder of their own citizens. Yet, in March 1962, just such a plot landed on the desk of the United States Secretary of Defense. This insane plan was concocted by the Joint Chiefs of Staff under the watchful eye of General Lyman Lemnitzer. They called this cannibalistic scribble Operation Northwoods. The military desperately wanted to start a war against Cuba and Fidel Castro, but an invasion required a cast-iron pretext that would make the entire world howl with rage. And so the generals decided to simply stage this pretext, staging a massive bloodbath right under the noses of the common people. The scenario was astoundingly cynical. They proposed detonating bombs in Miami, setting fires in Washington, and sinking refugee boats at sea. The generals planned to hire fake saboteurs, dress them in Cuban uniforms, and have them cause riots at the gates of the Guantanamo Bay military base. They also envisioned blowing up warehouses, burning airplanes, and even holding ceremonial funerals for fictitious victims. But these were minor mischiefs compared to their masterpiece. They wanted to stage a dramatic takedown of a passenger jet. The plan was to take a real civilian aircraft, board students under false names, and fly them into the air. Meanwhile, at Eglin Air Force Base, they were preparing an exact replica of the plane, converted into an unmanned drone. The real plane would be secretly landed in midair, and a radio-controlled duplicate would be launched in its place. It would be blown up over the sea, simulating an attack by Cuban fighter jets. All this nonsense had the official signatures of the highest military leadership. They didn't care about international law or the lives of their own citizens. The world was saved only by President John F. Kennedy's dismissal of this initiative, either with laughter or horror. General Lemnitzer was soon politely dismissed, and the documents were hidden in the archives. The plan was declassified only 40 years later, proving that the state machine is ready to devour anyone. Biomimetic CIA. Spies. Paranoia is a funny thing. If you'd told your acquaintances in the park 50 years ago that your conversations were being monitored by that fat fly or that suspicious pigeon on the ledge, you'd have been quickly sent to a mental institution. For decades, the intelligence agencies ridiculed these theories, portraying them as crazy. It turns out the paranoids were right. The intelligence agencies have indeed been trying for years to turn the planet's fauna into a spy zoo with microphones and batteries. In the 1970s, the best minds at the Central Intelligence Agency, instead of solving global problems, were hand-painting mechanical dragonflies. They created a contraption called an insectopter, 6 centimeters long, with a 9-inch wingspan. This microscopic robot was designed to fly up to enemy spies and land on their shoulders. Inside, a tiny engine drove pistons and moved the wings, while residual gas whistled out the back, creating additional thrust. Guidance was controlled by a laser beam. A brilliant idea, but the designers forgot basic physics. The toy weighed just 1 gram. As a result, the first light breeze of over 8 kilometers per hour blew this masterpiece of engineering into the nearest bushes. Millions of dollars were wasted simply because wind exists. But the spies weren't satisfied. They decided to use real birds. They took ordinary city pigeons, strapped miniature cameras to their chests, and released them to fly over Soviet military installations. The birds flew home, photographing secret bases along the way. The images produced higher resolution than those produced by satellites. The agents even tried training the birds to drop bugs on windowsills. However, the pigeons turned out to be quite selfish. They ignored orders, flew wherever they pleased, and instead of secret blueprints, produced gigabytes of blurry photos of garbage dumps. In the 1990s, the crazy zoo moved underwater. The labs created Charlie, a robotic catfish. This sealed steel, double-hulled creature was designed to silently swim upstream and collect water samples near secret enemy chemical plants. The catfish was controlled via a standard remote control via radio. Add to this a 19-gram nano hummingbird created in 2011. It could hover in the air and broadcast video. So when a bird lands on your window and starts staring into your eyes, don't rush to throw it breadcrumbs. Perhaps somewhere overseas, a sullen cameraman is simply adjusting the focus on your cup of coffee. The Tonkin Incident. Previously, only the most paranoid believed that governments would deliberately drag their countries into monstrous, bloody wars for trumped-up reasons. Ordinary people simply shook their heads when they heard tales of staged attacks. But history has shown that statesmen can lie with crystal-clear eyes, cold-bloodedly dispatching people to slaughter. The Tonkin Incident demonstrated how easy it is to drive an entire nation into slaughter with cheap clowning. In early August 1964, American ships conducted covert electronic reconnaissance in the Gulf of Tonkin. On August 2nd, a minor skirmish between the American destroyer Maddox and North Vietnamese boats did indeed occur. There were no holes in the sides or casualties. But on August 4th, the American sailors' sanity finally gave way. That night, during a storm, the destroyers Maddox and Turner Joy suddenly began firing frantically into the void, firing hundreds of heavy shells. Radars were emitting insane amounts of interference. Captain John Herrick almost immediately doubted the attack and radioed headquarters that the radar signals were simply due to the weather and the sailors' panic. The crew managed to mistake the noise of their own propellers during a sharp turn for enemy torpedoes. Aircraft pilots overhead also failed to spot a single Vietnamese boat in the water. But in Washington, these sober reports mattered little. President Lyndon Johnson urgently needed a beautiful and convincing pretext for escalation. The White House simply tossed the captain's doubts into the trash. A declassified study by National Security Agency historian Robert Haniock revealed the ugly truth. It turned out that intelligence bureaucrats had stupidly rewritten reports and falsified radio intercepts. They erased any mention of uncertainty to portray chaotic radar activity as planned communist aggression. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara brazenly lied to Congress, concealing the military's doubts. The lie worked flawlessly. Terrified congressmen passed the Tonkin Resolution almost unanimously. The president was given absolute freedom of action without any formal declaration of war. America was bogged down in the Vietnamese quagmire, having sent more than 500,000 soldiers into the jungle. Millions of people died, simply because a handful of metropolitan careerists decided to use false radar blips for geopolitical games. Years later, McNamara admitted that the August 4th attack never happened, but these admissions did not bring back the lives of the men who died. Project Fruit Machine. The state secretly created a device for reading secret thoughts and seeking out forbidden desires. For decades, ordinary people dismissed such stories. Paranoia, the ravings of madmen. However, in the early 1960s, the Canadian authorities carried out just such a large-scale conspiracy against their own citizens. They decided to completely purge all people with non-traditional sexual orientations from government ministries, the army, and the police. Officials allocated $10,000 for this insane purge. The authorities appointed psychology professor Frank Robert Wake as the main executor. Mounted police affectionately nicknamed his brainchild the Fruit Machine. The officers seated the candidates in a terrifying chair, reminiscent of a dentist's. Engineers placed a black box with a screen right in front of the victim's face. Then the circus began. The experimenters showed the victim slides. The scenes ranged from dull landscapes to explicit male erotica. Meanwhile, the cameras zoomed in on their eyes. The professor's pseudoscientific theory held that the pupil would inevitably dilate upon seeing a pleasant object, an involuntary reaction, ironclad evidence. But the device lied. Constantly. It couldn't have been otherwise. The scientific elite ignored basic biology. The human eye reacts to dozens of different stimuli. Headlights outside the window, ordinary fear, stuffiness, banal fatigue. Even a simple change in the brightness of images caused the pupils to constrict. But the investigators stubbornly continued interrogations for weeks. They herded subjects into small rooms and bombarded them with dirty, intimate questions. Officials ruined thousands of lives in cold blood. They fired people from their jobs, never to return. Shame. Poverty. Some unfortunates committed suicide. The police busily fabricated cases, building a database of over 9,000 people. The Secret Services searched everywhere for distinguishing characteristics of suspects. They included driving white cars, pink rings on the pinky finger, and excessively tight pants in their manuals. A mad bureaucratic machine unleashed terror out of nowhere, and all for the sake of a foolish attempt to get into the citizens' beds. The U.S. government's denaturation of alcohol. Yet another wild conspiracy theory posits that the government is capable of cold-bloodedly poisoning its citizens to break them of bad habits. People laughed at this nonsense. The state is supposed to protect, not kill. But during Prohibition, officials in the United States unleashed a veritable chemical war against their own population. It all began in 1920, when alcohol was completely banned across the country. The nation didn't give up drinking. Demand gave birth to a gigantic black market. Bootleggers quickly realized that ordinary industrial alcohol, used for varnishes and paints, could be cheaply purified and sold as premium whiskey. Federal authorities spent a long time banging their heads against the wall, trying to stem the flow. Police raided illegal distilleries, but the alcohol supply only grew. Then, the Treasury Department hatched a truly diabolical plan. They decided to make industrial ethanol a deadly poison. In 1926, officials ordered factory chemists to pour lethal doses of methanol, gasoline, and toxic benzene into barrels. The logic of the Washington geniuses was as simple as a toothpick. People would learn that their booze was poisoned, become frightened, and start sobering up. But they underestimated the greed of the shady dealers and the stupidity of the average person. Underground chemists tried to purify this hellish cocktail in primitive stills. Purifying it completely was simply physically impossible. The methyl alcohol still poisoned every bottle. The dealers pumped this poison into bars, knowing that customers would go blind and die. They didn't care. The first major nightmare occurred right on Christmas Day, 1926. Dozens of delirious people with raging abdominal pains flocked to New York's Bellevue Hospital. Death was instantaneous. Over the course of several holiday days, doctors in just one city recorded dozens of corpses. But this didn't deter officials. Leading temperance lobbyist Wayne Wheeler cynically declared that these people were committing suicide, and the government wasn't obligated to serve them straight vodka. New York City's chief medical examiner, Charles Norris, furiously called the situation a government-sponsored extermination program. By the time Prohibition was lifted in 1933, this insane chemical attack had claimed the lives of more than 10,000 people. Another 100,000 suffered severe paralysis from cheap, imitation Ginger Jake. The authorities simply wrote off these human lives as collateral damage in their foolish fight for moral purity. So much for their concern for the nation's health. The CIA's fake vaccination campaign in Pakistan. A couple of paranoid fanatics spent years shouting in public squares that all these white coats and charitable injections were just a dirty cover for foreign spies. Ordinary people winced in disgust. They were fools, they said, savages, afraid of progress and syringes, seeing American intelligence conspiracies everywhere. However, in 2011, the Central Intelligence Agency decided to prove that paranoia is simply very good intuition. At the time, the Americans were desperately searching for the #1 terrorist, Osama bin Laden. They had tracked down a suspicious remote mansion in the Pakistani city of Abbottabad, but were afraid to storm it without a trace. They needed absolute confirmation. And then, deep within Langley, a brilliant and vile idea hatched. The intelligence services recruited a respected local doctor named Shakil Afridi. He was tasked with organizing a completely free and extremely generous hepatitis vaccination campaign. The premise of this charade was cynical to the extreme. Under a plausible pretext, nurses were to enter a gated community and inject children. They were then to secretly store blood samples directly on the used needles. This genetic information was planned to be quickly compared with the DNA of bin Laden's sister, who had died in Boston. To make the performance as realistic as possible, the doctor began administering the vaccines first in the poorest neighborhoods on the outskirts. Then his team moved closer to the target. One of the hired nurses actually managed to penetrate the high fence, but spy medicine quickly went to hell. CIA agents didn't care about public health. Hepatitis requires 3 consecutive injections spaced out. But as soon as the medics collected the samples they needed in a wealthy neighborhood, they quickly closed up shop, abandoning the poor with the first doses. Pakistani counterintelligence quickly pieced together this strange puzzle. Dr. Afridi was arrested and sent to prison for 33 years. The fun began later. When this grand deception was exposed, the entire Middle East erupted in flames. Enraged local religious leaders were given a powerful trump card. They declared vaccines a Western conspiracy to sterilize Muslim children. A full-scale hunt for honest doctors began. Radicals began shooting down mobile medical teams right on the roads. Global healthcare programs were completely destroyed. By 2014, Pakistan had become the world's leading source of polio. The CIA eventually banned its agents from using medicine for surveillance, but it was too late. Thousands of maimed children paid with their health because American spies desperately wanted to obtain the DNA of one dead person. Operation Seabreeze. The idea that government agencies were using entire metropolises as giant petri dishes for their secret testing was long considered the ravings of madmen. The public firmly believed in their own security and twirled their fingers at their temples at the very mention of conspiracy. However, in September 1950, the American military proved that its own citizens had become mere lab rats. The military staged an unauthorized biological attack right on the streets of San Francisco. The military gave this abomination the beautiful code name Seabreeze. For a whole week, an army ship cruised the California coast, spraying 2 types of bacteria into the air by the ton: Serratia marcescens and Bacillus globigium. The generals stubbornly believed these microorganisms to be completely harmless biological weapons simulants. They were desperate to find out how easy it was to infect a large city with a simple aerosol. They found out. The wind picked up the invisible cloud and carried the contagion throughout residential areas. Sensors detected the bacteria even as far as 37 kilometers from the coast. Army officials later proudly tallied the results of this stunt. Nearly every one of San Francisco's 800,000 residents inhaled at least 5,000 deadly particles. This amount was exactly equivalent to a lethal dose of military-grade anthrax. In other words, had the test microbes been replaced by a real pathogen, the city would have been transformed into a gigantic morgue in a matter of days. And all of this was carried out without the slightest warning from local authorities and medical professionals. Why bother the herd with unnecessary questions? But the bacterium Serratia marcescens suddenly decided to show its teeth. 2 weeks later, the first victims began arriving at Stanford Hospital. 11 people came down with severe urinary tract infections. Doctors were shocked by the abnormal outbreak. The patients' test results glowed with a characteristic blood-red pigment. 10 patients somehow pulled through. But one elderly man named Edward Nevin, recovering from a routine prostate surgery, died 3 weeks later. The infection had penetrated directly into his heart, destroying the valves. The deceased's family only learned of the experiment 26 years later from the press. They tried to sue, but the legal system doesn't give up on its own. The court cynically dismissed the lawsuit, declaring that the plaintiffs couldn't prove a 100% connection between the Army fog and the old man's death. Project Sunshine. Rumors that the government was secretly stealing the bodies of dead babies from hospitals for nuclear experiments were long considered the ravings of lunatics. The general public shook their heads, refusing to believe such necrophilia. However, in 1953, American agencies launched the secret Project Sunshine. This paranoid nightmare instantly became reality. Scientists at the Atomic Energy Commission were desperate to learn how nuclear fallout accumulates in humans. Strontium-90 was deemed the most dangerous threat. This nasty stuff disguises itself as calcium, embeds itself in the skeleton, and burns it from the inside with radiation. The best target for the isotope was young, growing bones. The researchers desperately needed bone material from deceased infants. But how could they legally obtain hundreds of children's corpses? Project director Willard Libby offered a stunningly cynical response. He declared that anyone skilled in grave robbing and body snatching would be doing their country a huge service. They even hired an expensive law firm to research the laws governing body snatching. But no legal loopholes were found. So the intelligence agencies decided to simply steal the bones without permission. They created a global network of medical vultures. Loyal doctors and hospitals in the UK, Australia, and Canada began secretly removing bones from deceased children during autopsies. This was done without the mother's consent. One British woman had her stillborn child's legs cut off. To conceal the theft, the woman was forbidden from dressing the baby for burial. In total, these state vultures stole more than 1,500 children's bodies. The stolen bones were burned by the ton in high-temperature furnaces, turning them into dust for spectral analysis. The human remains were written off as ordinary consumables. The exposure of this orgy sparked a huge scandal, but officials cynically remained silent. So much for the state's concern for children. The CIA's Tibet program. Theories that saintly global leaders and recognized icons of pacifism are secretly on the payroll of the planet's premier spy agency usually make ordinary people wince in disgust. It's hard to believe that a man who preaches universal love and compassion could be involved in secret conspiracies, arms procurement, and the financing of saboteurs. But when the archives were finally opened, the laughter abruptly stopped. It was revealed that the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Buddhists and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, had been receiving money directly from the Central Intelligence Agency for years. In the late 1950s, China finally had Tibet firmly in its grasp, and the Americans immediately saw this as a golden opportunity to spark a conflagration right under the communists' thumb. The intelligence services launched a massive covert program. The idea was as simple as pie. Use the local population as cannon fodder to weaken Beijing. The CIA began secretly recruiting, training, and arming Tibetan guerrilla units at bases in Nepal. They eventually formed a full-fledged paramilitary force, numbering over 2,100. American rifles, ammunition, and rations were dropped there by the ton, while simultaneously fanning the flames of trampled freedom in the press. The total annual budget of this Tibetan sabotage operation exceeded $1,700,000. The most intriguing item in these financial statements was the personal salary of the Dalai Lama himself. The spiritual leader, who built his brand on absolute nonviolence, took exactly $180,000 annually from American intelligence agents. The connection with the spies was maintained through his brother, Gallo Thondup, who had become the administration's main secret asset back in 1956. The Dalai Lama, of course, later justified this, claiming that he spent these dollars solely on supporting his government in exile. But who cares? While he traveled the world with a gentle gaze and lectured on compassion, behind him stood an organization that simultaneously staged military coups and assassinations across the planet. But the cynicism of the situation was fully revealed in 1972. President Richard Nixon decided to befriend Beijing for geopolitical gain. At the same moment, American spies threw the Tibetans out into the cold, cutting off all funding. Yesterday's guerrillas were left alone against the Chinese army. The Dalai Lama later sadly noted that the United States had never cared about Tibet's independence, but simply used them as bargaining chips in its Cold War. Used and discarded. The Edith Wilson precedent. Tales of a great power being governed not by an elected leader, but by a mysterious power broker behind them, are usually dismissed as the ravings of cheap conspiracy theorists. People wince in disgust. Paranoia, they say. Get your head straight. We have a constitution, elections, and democracy. How can one secretly seize power in the office of the head of state? It turns out it's very simple. At the beginning of the 20th century, the United States of America was ruled for 17 months by an unelected woman. And this grand conspiracy unfolded right in the bed of the paralyzed president. In the fall of 1919, President Woodrow Wilson returned from a grueling tour, completely shattered. On October 2nd, he suffered a devastating stroke. The nation's leader was paralyzed. The left side of his body was completely paralyzed. He was partially blind and could barely speak. In any normal country, an incapacitated politician would immediately retire. But his wife, Edith Wilson, decided otherwise. She was terrified that being removed from office would kill her husband. She coldly blocked all entrances to his sickbed. She concealed the scale of the disaster from his cabinet, the press, and Congress. Vice President Thomas Marshall learned his news from rumors. The era of bedside government had arrived, with his wife the only channel of communication with the leader. This lady single-handedly decided which laws and reports were worthy of her ailing husband's attention. She became the ultimate filter for any government information. She allegedly read the necessary documents to her husband and then returned them with his prepared decisions. In reality, Edith simply governed the country at her own discretion. When Congress passed the Volstead Act, which instituted prohibition, a presidential veto suddenly appeared on the document. Historians later proved that Wilson was physically incapable of comprehending the text. The First Lady either wrote it with a shaky hand or simply forged his signature on the paper. And she simply fired Secretary of State Robert Lansing, who attempted to convene cabinet meetings without her knowledge. And this entire circus took place without any legal basis. The law at the time lacked a mechanism for transferring power during presidential illness. The 25th Amendment to the Constitution wasn't adopted until 50 years later. While officials stood confusedly at the door, an ordinary housewife staged a quiet coup to save her man. She didn't care about state interests or the collapsed international treaties. And this isn't the ravings of crazy conspiracy theorists, but a true historical fact. For a year and a half, the country became the personal fiefdom of one loving woman. The Acoustic Kitten Project. In the delusions of a paranoid, a pet often turns into a recruited agent for enemy intelligence. Crazies scream hysterically that their cats are eavesdropping on their secrets by the fireplace and transmitting the recordings to secret centers. Normal citizens advise them to change psychiatrists. But in the 1960s, the the Central Intelligence Agency decided to turn this delusion into harsh reality. The spies launched a project codenamed Acoustic Kitten. They thoughtlessly squandered around $20 million on this venture. Some closet genius decided to turn an ordinary stray cat into a walking voice recorder. After all, the animal can go anywhere. No Soviet diplomat would hide secrets from a friendly, furry guest. The surgeons set about their work with vivisectionist fervor. They performed a highly complex operation. They implanted a microphone directly into the cat's ear canal, hid a radio transmitter at the base of its skull, and threaded a thin wire antenna under its fur along its spine. But a silly problem arose. The cat was constantly distracted by food. She couldn't care less about the Cold War when there were satiating flies flying around or the smell of sausage in the air. The designers were forced to perform another operation. They surgically blunted the cat's sense of hunger. The result was the perfect, furry cyborg. The first baptism of fire was scheduled for a park on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, D.C., right next to the Soviet embassy. The special agents locked themselves in a van with a ton of recording equipment. They focused their lenses on two men chatting amiably on a bench near the lawn. The cat was carefully placed on the pavement. All she had to do was quietly walk a few meters and sit down next to them. The ending of this drama was worthy of a cheap comedy. The cat took literally a couple of steps toward his goal. But then an ordinary city taxi came flying around the corner and instantly flattened the expensive agent. $20 million turned into a wet spot on the road. Of course, years later, some former bosses timidly tried to justify themselves. They brazenly claimed that no one had killed the cat. It had supposedly been sewn back up and lived a happy life. But the program was still shamefully shut down in 1967. Management officially acknowledged its own impotence, declaring cats completely untrainable for serious espionage. So when your pet stares at you, perhaps someone else's dead pixel is hiding behind its whiskers. Wright Laboratories' love gas. Conspiracy theories about a secret weapon capable of instantly altering human biology and breaking soldiers' wills long seemed the height of idiocy. The general public was convinced that stern generals thought only of tanks, shells, and bombing raids. However, actual archival files revealed the terrifying truth. American military officials were indeed attempting to create a chemical that would transform brutal soldiers into gentle lovers. In 1994, the Wright Research Laboratory in Ohio concocted a short 3-page document. Military experts unabashedly requested a massive $7.5 million budget from the Pentagon for a 6-year project. They wanted to create a bomb that would spray super-potent female sex pheromones directly over enemy trenches. The idea was simple and absurd. Under the influence of this cloud, enemy soldiers would be inflamed with an irresistible passion for each other. Morale plummets. Discipline collapses. Instead of firing and defending their lines, the army descends into a love frenzy. This crazy paper contained other brilliant ideas. For example, the designers proposed spraying enemies with special substances that would attract swarms of enraged wild wasps and bees. Another project envisioned creating a chemical that would induce a terrible, unbearable odor from the soldiers' breath. The enemy would choke on their own stench and reveal their positions. A true feat of military science. The Pentagon later offered feeble justification, claiming it was just a private initiative by one idiot that was promptly thrown out. But human rights activists from the organization Sunshine brought these secret plans into the open through the Freedom of Information Act. The public roared with laughter. In 2007, the creators of this marvel were even awarded the Ig Nobel Peace Prize. Representatives of the U.S. Air Force, for some reason, flatly refused to go to Harvard to receive their well-deserved award. The very idea that deep within the defense establishment, grown men are seriously planning to wage war with love gas makes one seriously question the mental health of those with their fingers on the nuclear button.